No matter how much Bitcoin BlackRock and Larry Fink own, they don't get to control the network. That is really what we mean by decentralized financial system. No matter how wealthy you are, you get in line in the blocks just like everybody else.
You've been in Bitcoin for a long time. How strange was it for you to see Trump at that Bitcoin conference in Nashville?
Even if you don't believe that he actually understands Bitcoin or believes in Bitcoin, I think he's at a point where he's like, there's a lot of people who own this thing. I think this is good for America because they think it's good for America, and I'm going to protect it. That's actually what you want in a politician, is you want them to exhibit the will of the people regardless of what they believe.
What have you learned about memes and what you think people don't understand about them?
Berkshire Hathaway is the boomer meme coin. Warren Buffett is the financial influencer. People go to the capitalist mecca, Omaha, Nebraska, to go and sit and listen to this man talk as if he's the reincarnation of a capitalist Jesus. And the 22-year-old Gen Zer is doing the exact same thing. It's just that their asset is different. The kids are being rational given the situation that they're in.
And what is your ultimate message then to the Gen Zs or Gen Alphas?
If you create things, if you are able to stomach volatility, you are on the right path.
I want to jump into this book. It's called How to Live an Extraordinary Life. It's 65 letters written to your children that are now 1 and 3. How did this happen?
As I started to write the first letter, I realized I want to pass some sort of knowledge on. And then the second thing was, I realized that it wasn't just advice for my kids. I could hand that same book to people I met in life. And so somewhere between 5 and 10 letters, I decided, well, let's take a step further, go even bigger. What if I just turn it into a book? What I found the most enjoyment out of is the people who write to me and say, hey, I'm writing a letter to my kid now.
Hey, I know investing in crypto is scary. It takes a real leap of faith because there are so many scams, rug pulls, and bad actors out there. It's a dangerous business, which is why 95% of people lose all their money. Well, that's why I created the London Real Investment Club, so you can access the hottest deals on the planet and use the crypto bull market to create the generational wealth that you deserve. Join my team of over 100 people from around the world that are making millions of dollars behind the scenes investing in blockchain, AI, Web3 games, DeFi, Bitcoin, and more. Don't miss out. Click the link below to book a call with one of my team now. But hurry, this bull market will end soon.
I know investing in crypto can be scary. That's why you gotta join the investment club. Pull the trigger. Let's do this.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Anthony Pompliano, the entrepreneur, investor, Bitcoin advocate, and author. You are the founder and CEO of Professional Capital Management and have built and sold many successful businesses and invested in over 200 companies. You are the host of the Pomp Podcast, where you discuss technology and economics with a wide range of leading experts. And your new book, How to Live an Extraordinary Life, is a series of 65 letters written to your children, explaining how to succeed in business, have great relationships, and live a healthy and happy life. You have argued that central banks are now flooding economies with large amounts of capital, which will lead to the devaluation of the dollar and other fiat currencies, while simultaneously boosting digital asset prices. You have called Bitcoin gold with wings, and ultimately believe that true wealth and financial freedom come from finding and holding high quality assets forever. Anthony, welcome to London Real.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian.
Look, it's great to have you here. I've been watching your content for years and looking forward to talking about the book as well. I guess first I wanted to ask, since you're in the States, how How do things feel there? How important, in your opinion, is this election to crypto and blockchain and maybe even finance in general?
Yeah, I think that politics is very unique in that everyone cares about it. But if you look in their day-to-day lives, it's very hard to see where it shows up. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Housing affordability in the United States right now is atrocious. It's some of the worst it's been in 40 or 50 years. The federal government actually can't do that much to solve the problem. It's much more reliant on your local city council or your local government. And so things like regulation are standing in the way, but the federal government doesn't necessarily have oversight on that. And so I joke sometimes and I say, who's on the city council may be more important than who's in the White House. And so I do think that some of that is playing into it. But also, if you look at the two candidates, these two candidates are much more similar than maybe people would recognize on its face. They obviously have different policies, but their approach to this election is very similar. What I mean by that is they're both populist candidates. So they're going after the same exact audience. They're trying to convince that kind of independent voter base or undecided voter base to sway. They have very specific tax cut policies. Usually it's the Republicans that get labeled as trying to use tax cuts. But the Democrats in this election in particular, they're trying to do a $25,000, first-time home buyer help. They're doing a $6,000 child tax credit. They're looking for a $50,000 tax benefit for small business owners. So tax cuts is this huge thing and it's going after from a populist perspective. On top of that, they actually agree on way more than I think we thought they would agree on at the beginning of this. They both want a southern border wall now. They both want no tax on tips. And so you kind of see this playing out, and what you realize is, okay, that's policy related. Their approach in terms of going on podcasts, watching Donald Trump talk to Theo Vaughn about cocaine obviously goes super viral. And then you watch Kamala Harris talk to Alex Cooper on Call Her Daddy, and that goes super viral. And so what I've taken away from this entire election cycle is the world has changed. This is not our grandparents' politics anymore. This is not kind of traditional appointment viewing television that we live in. And so instead it's, shows like yours, it's various podcasts, it's social media. That is really driving the conversation. And so when you are engulfed in that world, everything feels fast. But you have to remember that, it was less than 4 years ago, Donald Trump was in the White House. Less than 4 years ago, Joe Biden took over. Less than 4 years ago was the global pandemic that literally locked people at home, both in the United States and abroad. And so a lot of stuff can change in a very short period of time. When you think of it from an investing perspective, how do you just ignore a lot of that noise and realize that sometimes the best thing to do is just do nothing? Kind of make your bets, hold them for a long time. And so I think that is the, kind of challenge of our generation is how do you stay informed on current events, but avoid going crazy? I got a lot of friends who became insane, paying attention to all the politics. And I think that's really where, kind of we're headed now is you want to know what's going on, but also how do you not let it affect you?
Politics has changed so much, when I was a kid or maybe when you were a kid where, it wasn't as newsworthy. It wasn't in our social media. It wasn't entertainment. It was something that would happen every now and then. I kind of remember the Ross Perot debate. I remember little bits here and there, but it wasn't something that really qualified as entertainment. It wouldn't infect people's heads, but now it really is placed there. Some people say that we kind of project on our politicians that they're going to solve all our problems. And maybe you kind of alluded to that with the fact that maybe it has a lot more to do with local politics and maybe even yourself with your own actions. Do you think that it has become something that it really isn't as far as entertainment and maybe a solution to all your problems?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. And I think, maybe the first thing is I literally wrote a book specifically talking about all these different life lessons. But if I had to sum up one common thread, it's that people have agency. You get to do the things that you decide to do. And so whether that is, concepts like luck not being real or hard work being important, it's all about you having the agency. Now, why do people not feel like that is, kind of the path forward? It's because everything around them, the kind of digital environment is telling them you're not in control. We are going to tell you what to do. We are going to program your mind. We are going to show you how bad the world is. The best point in history to live is in the future. The second best time to live is today. And I constantly remind people that we live in the safest, most prosperous time in human history today. It doesn't feel like that when you read the internet or you watch TV or you look at what the newspapers are writing. And so that agency gets sucked out of people's brains. And instead, we start to say, who is coming to save me? And so if you look at the United States specifically, we have become much more of a welfare state than we previously were. You see that not old people, I mean, people expect in different nation states for older people to become dependent on the government. They run out of money, they don't have retirement savings, all these kind of social safety net programs. We also expect maybe, the people who are in the most dire situations among us, homeless, people in poverty, et cetera, they begin to depend on the state. In the United States of America, there are people who are young, healthy, who should be productive. They're depending on the nation state. And so anytime that you get a situation where people who should be productive, who should actually be creating their own income, who should be, doing things in society, they become part of that welfare state. You have to ask, one, what is the psychological, kind of development that got us to that point where they think it's okay and they're actually looking for the handout? But then two is, what's happened in the government where we're actually handing this money out? And so I think that the United States is, kind of following the classic trajectory of a nation state who we have the position of luxury where things like depression, things like welfare state, all have become the norm. And I always point back and, I saw this clip of 50 Cent talking about depression being a luxury, and it's just seared in my brain. He said, where I come from, we don't have the luxury of being depressed. Everyone is so focused on what is the next thing that I have to do to get food on the table so my kids can eat tonight. And again, I didn't grow up in that environment. And so it's hard for me to understand exactly what he's talking about on a day-to-day basis. But this idea that as a country in the United States, we are so fortunate, we're so prosperous that people can stand around and complain about stupid things. Go back 100 years. We didn't have that luxury. People had to work. And so in a weird way, our success is actually beginning to kind of collapse on itself and lead to some of the absurdity that we see in the media.
Yeah, there's a great line from the book where you say the best response to failure is hard work. And I've had guests over the years like Jocko Willink to talk about extreme ownership, and he'll make this comparison. He'll come back from like Ramadi in Iraq and then look around and everyone's complaining because they don't have the oat milk or their Explorers, power suspension doesn't work. And they just see these these dichotomy of worlds where one, you really have to put yourself to the test. And then the other one, it's almost too luxurious. And yeah, people have said that the state has kind of replaced the nuclear family somehow. And you could say in some ways it has. And you mentioned COVID. COVID was a bit like that as well, where it was like, well, the state's going to tell you what to do, as opposed to, okay, you do what you want to do, or you can make some decisions on your own. And I think that also programmed people in. And so, yeah, I think books like this are really important to try to put that back on to people and make them realize that it's ultimately on you. I think Vivek Ramaswamy is real popular in saying, he said that the single most important determining factor in your success is you. And I really like the way he's said that recently, and it kind of stuck out in my mind. Just to finish up on the election, I think they've said that now maybe 6 counties in the entire United States could determine this election. And do you find that kind of strange that, a democracy with 350 million people could ultimately come down to just a few small areas and these few small swing states? And I'm wondering what the founding fathers might say about that. And is that sustainable in the future? Is that healthy? Is it not? I don't know. Do you have thoughts on that?
When it comes to the actual election process and kind of how do we draw district lines? How do we think about the electoral college versus the general population vote? There's a whole bunch to unpack there. I think the most important thing is asking ourselves, does the election reflect the will of the people? And there's a lot of debate as to whether that answer is true or not. What I've taken, a little bit of interest in doing is looking around the world. Forget the United States for a second. I grew up in this system. I understand it just enough to be dangerous in a conversation, but I'm not an expert on it. But let me go look around the world. And what I find really interesting is that there are places, take the recent Venezuelan election, where it is highly contested. The United States is saying that one side won. The incumbent is saying that they won. And when you go and you look at what the U.S. and critics are pointing to as the things the incumbents did in order to help their chances, all the way to potentially cheat. And then you extrapolate that back to the U.S. You say, listen, this is not a Republican or Democrat thing. This is both political parties constantly, kind of competing with each other as to how to give themselves an advantage. And so, there's obviously with the 2020 election, a ton of conversation as to what was, a fair and free election and were there any issues there, et cetera. Put all of that aside for a second. Let's look at the things that people actually agree upon. And if you look at the things that people agree upon, is that it used to be that you went to the ballot box on one day. Everyone in the country voted on one day. Obviously now in the United States, you can vote for weeks in advance. And so there has been change. Nobody is denying that. Nobody is saying that that's not happening. But it begs the question, should it be happening? Is it actually helpful? Does it lead to a more fair and free election? Again, there's no right answer. People are going to debate these things back and forth. And so what I think ends up, if you kind of bring it to the current election, if you have a country where 50% of the population does not know if the election was free or fair, then obviously that is a big problem. And I say that because I think that in this election in particular, regardless of who wins, the other side is going to complain that the election was not fair. And so that is a very weird position to be in, maybe in the nicest, framing. It's a very dangerous position to be in on the kind of, not so nice framing. And so if we look at this election, what I actually think is really important is that it is not close. The best thing that could happen for America is that it is a landslide in either direction. Now, if it is close, you're going to get immense debate. You're going to get the other side screaming and saying, hey, somebody cheated, etc. If it's a landslide, it's really hard to claim that. And so if you look at some of the polling, if you look at prediction markets, there's a lot of volatility as well in this election, which I think is quite interesting. Historically, what you've seen is one candidate has an advantage. The other candidate is kind of the challenger. They're trying to gain ground, and it's all about can they gain the ground before the election day. In the last 4 to 5 weeks, right, and even if you extrapolate it out through July, take Donald Trump, for example. Assassination attempt, his odds spike. Joe Biden gets replaced, his odds drop. He comes back because he's got a great rally, spikes again. And so you almost have this like kind of jockeying back and forth between who's the leading candidate going into this election. One of the big questions for me is, who do we trust? Do we trust the polls or do we trust the prediction markets? I saw just recently that Nate Silver has a poll out, which has Kamala Harris leading by a pretty healthy margin, 5-6 points. The prediction markets right now have Donald Trump leading by about 8%. And so what you have is kind of a real-time skin in the game betting market versus kind of traditional polling. And I put Nate Silver as one of the best at the, figuring out how to actually poll and really figure out the answer. I don't know which one is actually accurate. And so we're going to find out. But I do think that in this election in particular, prediction markets are going to be seen kind of coming out of it as having been much more accurate than traditional polling. And if that is true, which is a big if, but if it is true, I do think it will change the way that people look at odds for financial, economic, social, political, kind of geopolitical, different types of events moving forward. And so if we become a society that looks at prediction markets for signal before we look at kind of our traditional information sources, that would be a very interesting and very different world to live in moving forward.
Yeah, I've been watching both of those things as well. Polymarket is kind of popular in the crypto circles because you can plug in your Polygon wallet and put significant amounts of money on these betting odds. And after Elon showed up at Trump's re-rally in Butler, those markets went from basically even, like you said, to 6, 7, 8 points. And again, I don't know if I trust that. I ran to be mayor of London 3 years ago. And at one point, the betting odds had me as number 2 because I think a bunch of our fans were placing bets that didn't mean that I was really number 2. And it didn't help when the BBC were going to do debates. They didn't invite me. So again, it's hard to say if that's the one, or then you look at these polls in the New York Times and clearly they're probably biased. Google probably is biased. And so, yeah, I think we're going to learn about which one was maybe more accurate. I still don't know. I can't believe that the market for Trump moved that much in 24 hours. And we've also heard of people in Polymarket trying to push things here and there for settlements. And again, at the end of the day, I guess it's just money moving markets. And we know sometimes markets don't actually reflect things. So it's good.
What I also think is really interesting, Brian, is that Elon Musk is a really interesting person in the election, because there are very few people who have the reach and the cult following that he has. You can think of Taylor Swift and some others that are on both sides of the political aisle, but he also has the substance to back up in terms of he's got a lot of money, so he can put that money to work. He can bring a very different audience to politics than maybe historically has paid attention. And then what I think is probably the most interesting is he can dominate headlines. One of my favorite questions when I meet reporters is always, who would I not expect that if you put them in the headline, they drive a lot of traffic? And, I've been surprised in the past, people will say Jamie Dimon. And it's like, hey, he's a big name. Obviously, he's very important, got a great job, but you wouldn't expect that to be the answer. Donald Trump is the obvious one that everyone, now knows. Elon Musk is probably the only person that can really rival Donald Trump in terms of driving traffic. And so you put these two people who have the ability to drive traffic and dominate the conversation together, campaigning. It makes sense why the prediction market moves, right? It just kind of, it takes over in terms of the mind share of people thinking about the election, at least 50% or so of the nation.
Yeah, it's stranger than fiction to watch this thing. And we're both in independent media, and you see the value sometimes of like a collab. Like you'll have a guest on your show and the sum is greater than the parts, and all of a sudden something happens. So yeah, Elon showing up at that rally. Obviously, Elon has his following, 200 million followers. Of course, then he owns Twitter, and there's all these aspects in there, and it's a weird synergy those two have. And then, of course, you got the Dream Team, and then Bobby Kennedy, who was on our show back in 2020 originally talking about COVID, and then to see him join that team, and then, the Cantor Fitzgerald BCG guy that's doing the transition, and Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, it's wild to watch. And so, yeah, you're right. Besides Trump, I'd say Musk is probably next in line for someone who can really move the needle from a perspective. And he's got his own platform, which also makes a difference. It's fascinating to watch. Speaking of Trump, you've been in Bitcoin for a long time. You've been an early adopter. You've been talking about it for a long time. How strange was it for you to see him show up at that Bitcoin conference in Nashville? Because I'm sure you remember the days where you might be denied a bank account for having crypto in your remit. And now to see a former president go there and say, never sell your Bitcoin, I'm going to fire Gary Gensler twice. What did you make of that? And was it surreal to watch?
One of the most interesting aspects of Bitcoin is that it has been a bottoms up adoption story. And so if you go and you study kind of historical technology adoption, it always starts with militaries or nation states. And then it kind of trickles down to corporations and then eventually individuals. So if you look at the computer as an example, you had to have a lot of money, right, to be able to get a computer, to get access to the internet. And it was used by militaries and nation states. Then there was the mainframe computers that ended up in offices or in universities. And people would literally trek across campus to be able to go use the computer. Then eventually last was people got to put a computer on their desk, in their home, in their pocket, as a smartphone, et cetera. Bitcoin was not adopted by nation states. It was not adopted by corporations. It was adopted by individuals. And frankly, it was adopted by the fringes of society to start. Computer programmers, cypherpunks, that whole crowd first. And so as that asset and that technology has been adopted, you have trickled up into financial organizations, corporations. Now we're starting to see nation states. And obviously militaries, I think, will also start to try to figure out how to use this as well. Now, as part of that adoption, there is a sequence that everyone goes through. When you first hear about Bitcoin, your initial reaction is, that's crazy. There's no way that could work. I don't like that thing. That sounds like it's something for criminals and bad, nefarious actors. And then you usually hear about it a little bit later. Tends to be when the price starts going up and your friends are talking about it again. And then you say, that thing's still around? What is this thing? Let me go and do a little bit of research. And then eventually you become a little bit more sympathetic to the story, but you haven't bought any yet. Eventually you buy some. And then very quickly after, you're like a hardcore Bitcoiner and you're telling everyone about, running a node or going outside in the sun or only eating meat or, whatever cultural thing that the Bitcoiners are into at any given time. I think that Donald Trump went through the same exact journey. He just did it in front of cameras at press conferences. Because when he first heard about it, he said, Basically, that's for bad people. I'm for the dollar. This Bitcoin thing is a threat to the dollar. I don't like it. Makes sense for the president of the United States to say that he doesn't like a threat to the US dollar. If Bitcoin was actually threatening the dollar, he should say that. What I think now has happened is he's had a lot of time go by. He's kept hearing about it. He realized it didn't die. He's had a lot of people spend time to educate him. And so if you go and you look at what he said at the Bitcoin conference, he said all the right talking points. But let's say, hey, you know what? This is politics, a lot of campaign promises. Let's just take 50% of what he says at face value. What I found most interesting is when he was talking about, let's say, Gary Gensler. And you could tell he was reading off the teleprompter and the crowd reaction. He kind of stepped back and you could see his like showman mindset take over. And he was like, oh, you guys like that? Let me say it again, right? And he kind of leaned into it.
Yeah.
But for people that have access to audiences, it's almost the best A/B testing ground for these ideas. And so politicians have a very unique role in society. We judge them on what we think they believe, but we want them to govern based on what we believe. So it's this very interesting dynamic of, regardless of what Donald Trump believes about Bitcoin, do we actually want him to carry out the will of the people on Bitcoin? And so even if you don't believe that he actually understands Bitcoin or believes in Bitcoin, et cetera, I think he's at a point where he's like, there's a lot of people who own this thing. I think this is good for America because they think it's good for America, and I'm going to protect it. And so that's actually what you want in a politician, is you want them to exhibit the will of the people regardless of what they believe. Now, the hard part is, are they going to do that or not? Part of the evaluation process is figuring out, who are they? What are their values? What do they believe? What do they say they're going to do? You got to kind of evaluate all that. Now, flip around to the other side. Kamala Harris, whether she was explicitly involved or not, the current administration has been very hostile to Bitcoin and the crypto industry. And so she, although the track record is very negative, and I think people rightfully so are saying, listen, we don't believe that you are going to become supportive because of what's gone on for the last 3.5 years. She has an advantage on Donald Trump. Today, she can take action in the next 30 days before the election and prove that she is sympathetic to Bitcoin and crypto. He can't do that. All he can do is promise things. He's out of office. But the current administration, they don't have to do a lot. 1 or 2 different actions could very quickly convince people, hey, you know what? Actually, maybe she is going to treat this differently. And she might not be able to switch people from being hardcore Trump supporters to become hardcore Kamala supporters. But if she could just maybe disincentivize their enthusiasm, bring them more towards the center, be less negative towards her, that probably would be a win. And so in a weird way, people in the crypto industry think this Bitcoin topic is so important. Everyone wants to talk about, what does Trump think? What does Kamala think? Who is going to do what? But the truth is, if you go outside the industry, nobody cares. This is not an actual issue that's going to decide who becomes president of the United States. We've now had 2 different presidential debates. It's not come up a single time. If you look at polling, nobody cares. And so in a weird way, this is like intellectual stimulation for a bunch of nerds on the internet. But the reason why they're not campaigning on this stuff, going and talking about it to kind of the general public outside of talking to directly crypto audiences, is because the general population doesn't care. They're asleep at the wheel. They have no clue what's going on with inflation. They have no clue about the erosion of purchasing power. They literally don't think that censorship is a problem. We live, again, in that prosperous country where we have the luxury of ignoring all these threats that other people around the world live under every day. And so it's actually a developing nation story. Those are the people who are running towards Bitcoin. Americans just look at it as maybe it's a get rich quick thing. Maybe I buy some, it goes up in price, and I tell all my friends how smart I am. But do I really think the bank, if I go to the ATM, isn't going to give me my money? No. Almost everybody in America believes the money's going to come. And so, again, Trump, I think, is hitting on an area where he thinks that there is passion, there's enthusiasm, there's fundraising capabilities, et cetera. But I think both candidates and their administrations know who is the next president of the United States is not going to be determined on how much do you support something like Bitcoin or crypto.
It's funny, I'm having flashbacks here. Because, back in 21, I spent 7 months running to be the next mayor of London. And it was so important to me. And I thought the issues were so important. I remember the day of the election, I was out campaigning in our big battle bus. And I stopped this woman on the street and I gave her the whole pitch. And she's like, okay, I'm just going to vote right now. I'm going to vote for you. And I realized that for 364 days of that year, She did not care who the mayor was. And she was one of the few people, probably 1 in 3, that was actually going to vote that day. And she just woke up and decided she would go vote. And she had 10 other problems that were more important and didn't care about my issues and really wasn't thinking about it. And so, yeah, in that sense, I guess you're probably right, is that most people, it's just not something that's in their pattern interrupt. They're worried about their kids and their bills and all the other things.
It's a huge problem in Western society, right? One of our greatest strengths is individualism. One of our greatest weaknesses is individualism. And so if you look at, there's this great study that's been done as to how many people die alone in Western society. An enormous amount compared to the rest of the world, right? If you go to India or many other countries around the world, what you find is that somebody gets old, they then are taken in by their family, usually their kids or their grandkids, they're taken care of, and they die within the family. The death experience in America is you die in a hospital, and hopefully you're lucky if you got 1 or 2 family members there. So the individualism leads to the kids want to be out on their own. They don't want their parents to move in with them. The individualism leads to the parent or the grandparent not wanting to have to be a burden to their kid. And so it's this very interesting dynamic around how much America specifically has been prosperous and productive and had all this economic growth because of the individualism, the belief in capitalism, the belief in entrepreneurship. But it also, does it degrade the human experience? And so if you go and you look at politics, the great politicians try to create collectivism. They try to bring people together. They want us all to sacrifice to some degree for the greater good. How do we together govern? How do we together live? How do we create a better future for our children? American ideals are not that, right? We get moments of it. After September 11th, patriotism is very high. People want to come together. They want to sacrifice for their neighbor. Times of war, same thing. But to that woman that you met in London on the day of voting, she's probably literally just thinking about, how do I go out and create a better life for me and my family today? I don't give a shit who is the politician. I don't care who is, making any of these decisions. And so that's a challenge for politicians. Forget what your policies are. How do you convince people to care who the actual person getting elected is? And so I think that's where you see in America right now, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris trying to figure out, how do we just get people to go out to the voting? How do we get them to go to the ballot box? Because we know if we can get people to turn out and vote, that it will change the election results. And I think Democrats historically have been very big proponents of getting out the vote because they know that they disproportionately benefit when that happens. But I'll tell you this, I just tweeted a clip of the Teamsters president, the union president. Historically, they have supported the Democratic candidate. They this year, I believe it's the first time in history, have decided not to endorse either candidate, which came from they polled their union members, and over 60% of them supported Donald Trump and not Kamala Harris. And so what he was talking about was he was saying the Democratic Party is supposed to be the party of the working people. Democratic Party is supposed to be promising, A, B, and C things for me, my union members, people like us. What have they done for us recently? And I took this clip, and what was so fascinating to me, forget for a second Republican, Democrat, what your politics are, all that stuff. If you study history, political parties evolve. They believe different things at different points in history. They support different groups of people. They look at, what do we actually have as our makeup of the political party? What are the issues of the day? Where do we stand? How do we want to govern? Who the candidates are? And they evolve. I believe right now, both in the United States and globally, we're going through a moment of transition where what it means to be on the left or on the right is changing. Again, I said that both politicians are populist candidates. You would never think that the Republican Party was taking a populist approach and potentially could garner more than 60% of the Teamsters support. But that is where the country is. And so both political parties are trying to figure out, okay, if the ground shifts underneath us, where do we stand? Who do we support? What are our policies? And maybe a glimmer of hope moving forward is that both candidates are getting pulled more towards the center. Kamala Harris was a very left-leaning senator, believed, I think was the number one most left politician. Donald Trump had many views that people would put as, kind of on the right in terms of women's reproductive rights, et cetera. He softened those. He now says, I don't support a national ban. I want to push this down to the states. I support IVF. Kamala Harris supporting a southern border wall, right? Not rolling back the tariffs on China, becoming much more centrist in some of her views. So if both candidates are getting pulled to the center, maybe the shifting of the ground is actually that people are saying, I just don't like extremism in any form. I actually want somebody who understands the plight of the people and is willing to just have common sense governance. The debate is, what is common sense? And, you're a better man than me for running for London mayor and trying to figure out, hey, how do I go and communicate what common sense is? But I think that's really where, kind of global politics is right now, is that as that ground shifts, the people who win, the people who garner attention are going to be the people who say, this is what I believe, this is who I want to serve, these are my policies, and they're going to be able to get enough people to rally around that to ultimately get them elected.
Yeah, it's fascinating times, like you said, to watch. I mean, to know that the Teamsters might pull for a Republican, never would we have thought that would happen 20, 30 years ago. And yeah, politics is fascinating. It's also crazy, and it'll drive you crazy if you run. Trust me. There was a member of parliament that pulled me aside and he said, Brian, politics is show business for ugly people, is what he told me. And then he laughed. And that was his advice to me. You told me about Trump's crypto adoption curve. I was wondering if you could tell me what you think of Larry Fink of BlackRock's crypto adoption curve. I had Scaramucci in here 6 months ago. And, he always tells this story of bumping into Larry in Davos a couple of years ago. And Larry came up to him and said, you like this Bitcoin thing? He's like, I don't like it. And I think Mooch was like, you know what? I suggest you spend another 10, 20 hours on it and do a deeper dive. Now, the Mooch won't take credit for this, but obviously Larry came full circle. Saylor likes to tweet out and joke that he's the chief marketing officer of Bitcoin, but now they own over 2% of the supply. And I'm curious, what do you think of that? And are you concerned that BlackRock, some say is just an arm of the government alongside of JP Morgan, might end up owning too much of Bitcoin or controlling too much of it? So I guess that's two questions in one.
Yeah, so I'm aware of a very concerted effort among some large Bitcoin holders who they said, Larry Fink is the key to getting a lot of changes to happen on Wall Street. And that concerted effort was to sit down with him, talk to him, educate him, and see, could he understand where they were coming from? Now, these people happen to be, kind of traditionally very successful finance people who happen to like Bitcoin. They weren't kind of your, cypherpunk kind of traditional Bitcoiner. And so they were very successful in that, maybe we'll call it an intervention of, hey, look, we own a lot of this. We think that this is good. Here's why we like it. Here's what we think the risks are. Here's how we think the world's going to play out in the future.
I joined the investment club because we are in the biggest wealth transfer in history. The investment thesis here is we believe that early stage Web3, metaverse and AI investments represent the hottest opportunities on the planet. I've been financially burned in this space, lost a lot of money through lack of education and investing in the wrong people, most of them were scams. But I still believe in blockchain and I still believe in the crypto space, thanks to the investment club. Now, 5 weeks in, I've invested in 10 deals in the investment club. They do all the due diligence and research for the community by bringing the best deal flow that we would never have access to. When you join, you just don't become a member. You become a part of a big family. Don't let this opportunity pass you by. You will never find a more genuine person like Brian. He is so transparent and passionate at bringing wealth to the masses through blockchain technology. Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure.
On top of what is an external, kind of marketing campaign, maybe to Larry Fink, kind of an audience of one, there was also an internal effort. So there's a gentleman, Robbie Mitchnick, who is the head of digital assets at BlackRock. There's a couple other people internally. They really worked hard to do the work, right? When you work inside the company, you can't just call up the big boss and say, hey, let's go to lunch. I got an idea. You got to kind of put together research. You got to put together an argument. You got to not only explain why is this asset going to be something that's going to be valuable in the future, but you also got to explain why is this good for our clients? Why is this good for our shareholders? How should we think about the risk? What is the compliance, right? All those things go into kind of forming that argument. And so I like to think that there's an external and an internal kind of intervention. And Larry Fink ultimately said, you know what? I do agree. I think that this is going to be a big thing. Him going on television talking about people buying Bitcoin as a flight to quality is a very big deal. I'd like to think of there's different seasons to Bitcoin, and the season of Bitcoiners being important for Bitcoin in terms of the marketing of Bitcoin is over. It is now the torch been passed to the Larry Finks of the world. No matter how hard anyone in the Bitcoin community tries to market Bitcoin, they will always be less important now than Larry Fink simply just saying Bitcoin is good. And so understanding kind of who has that torch is important. Now, what is important is the Bitcoiners that end up actually trying to defend the ethos of Bitcoin. And that leads into the conversation of, can someone own too much of Bitcoin? Michael Saylor owns over 1%. The Winklevoss twins, they own at least 1%. BlackRock has 2%. We very quickly can get to 10, 15% just on known people who own a lot of Bitcoin. Satoshi, over 800,000 Bitcoin, right? You just kind of go down the line. The beauty is that no matter how much Bitcoin you own, you do not control the network. You cannot manipulate it in a way that would be nefarious or malicious to anybody else. And so in a way that the US government was created, there's kind of these three branches of the US government, and they serve as checks and balances on each other. The Bitcoin network has those same checks and balances. It was devised in a very similar way. The software developers, you have the miners, and then you've got the node operators. And so each one of those groups serves as a check or a balance on the other groups. And we saw during the block size wars where over 80% of all mining hash rate tried to make changes. And it was the node operators who were able to stand up and defend Bitcoin. And so while most people would like to see decentralized ownership on top of a decentralized computational network, I think we can find solace in the fact that BlackRock could own 10% of Bitcoin, and they can't do anything different than you or I. And so I do think that is, kind of the beauty of what Satoshi created. What I wonder is if there's enough concentrated ownership, does the liquid supply, what is available for trading, become so little that we get more and more volatility over time? That is an unanswered question. Right now, we have seen volatility go down, but there is not too much imagination needed to find scenarios where actually volatility would go up. And it has to do with if BlackRock owns 5%, other people own, multiple percent, and they're just holding that supply on top of the individual Bitcoiners holding that supply. How many stocks have we seen float 1 or 2% of their total shares and they rip hundreds of percent? If that was to happen with Bitcoin in an asset where you can't issue more shares, you can't temper, kind of the enthusiasm, there's a lot of kind of crazy stuff that could happen. And so these are all things to pay attention to. But the beauty is that no matter how much Bitcoin BlackRock and Larry Fink own, they don't get to use the network any differently than you and I. And I think that is really what we mean by some sort of decentralized financial system is no matter how wealthy you are, you get in line in the blocks just like everybody else.
Yeah, that is part of the beauty of that tech. You mentioned Satoshi. There's this new HBO documentary where apparently they're going to reveal the identity. And of course, everyone's been guessing for years, and I don't think anyone's come up with a conclusion. But, Michael Saylor, I know you've talked to him. We've talked to him a couple of times. I think he said part of the beauty and maybe even the success of Bitcoin is having an anonymous founder and having that supply that's never moved. Do you think it's important to never know that identity? Do you have thoughts yourself? Do you think it ultimately promotes the value of Bitcoin when that person is anonymous?
It's less surface area to attack the asset.
Right.
If you look at Ether, the second largest cryptocurrency and network, how many people attack Vitalik Buterin? How many of them question when he says something? How many of them act differently when he says something? How many of them don't buy because they think he's acting weird at a conference? How many people buy the asset because they think he's really smart? Those things all play into it. And then, God forbid, Satoshi came out and was on one side of the political aisle or had a certain nationality that maybe was positive relationships with the US or negative relationships. We don't have to worry about any of that. It's just all of those what ifs get thrown to the side because we don't know. And so, I've said multiple times, the world is better off without knowing who Satoshi Nakamoto is. The beauty of this asset is decentralized. And what's fascinating, my wife thinks that Satoshi is a woman. And I asked her why. And she said, there's no man who could create that and not tell anyone. Which, again, forget for a second whether you agree with her or not. The fact that someone did create it and didn't tell anyone. It never has come out. It's one of the great mysteries of the world, but it's also one of the great gifts to the world because it means that we don't spend our time speculating on whether that person is good or bad.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.
Hey, I know investing in crypto is scary. It takes a real leap of faith because there are so many scams, rug pulls, and bad actors out there. It's a dangerous business, which is why 95% of people lose all their money. Well, that's why I created the London Real Investment Club, so you can access the hottest deals on the planet and use the crypto bull market to create the generational wealth that you deserve. Join my team of over 100 people from around the world that are making millions of dollars behind the scenes investing in blockchain, AI, Web3 games, DeFi, Bitcoin, and more. Don't miss out. Click the link below to book a call with one of my team now. But hurry, this bull market will end soon.
I know investing crypto can be scary. That's why you gotta join the investment club. Pull the trigger. Let's do this.